I would like to thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm Richard Stammelman. I'm the executive director of the Montgomery Endowment. And as I always say at the beginning of our fellows' lectures, it's a really great pleasure to present to you not only the lecture for today, but also the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, who together, I mean, they're not in the room, of course, but their presence is always with us, who way back in 1977, through their generosity, set up the Montgomery Endowment Fellows Program, which is truly unique in all of America in higher education. I mean, there are centers for the humanities and there's centers for biological studies, but this is unique because it brings very important people of great accomplishment who are also very nice people to work with undergraduates. And so way back in 1977, Haro and Ken knew that this would be an engaging presence or opportunity for Dartmouth students to meet these individuals and also to ask them questions. And so far, Winston Lord and Betty Bow Lord and the classes they have attended have really been very inspiring in the work that they've been talking about, their life's accomplishments. Former State Department Director of Policy Planning from 1973 to 77, former United States Ambassador to China from 1985 to 1989, and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 1993 to 1997, the Honorable Winston Lord has had a central and distinguished role in determining American foreign policy toward the Far East and in helping to restore U.S.-China relations during the last half of the 20th century. Educated at Yale and at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, it was no surprise that Ambassador Lord would begin a career in government service and international relations. His mother, Mary Pillsbury Lord, had served as the United States delegate to the United Nations and as the U.S. representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission during the Eisenhower administration. This was at a time when it was unusual for women to serve in such high-ranking governmental positions. In the early 1960s, Ambassador Lord worked at a variety of posts in the Defense Department and in the Foreign Service. From 1969 to 1973, he was on the planning staff of the National Security Council. In 1970, he became the special assistant to Henry Kissinger. I quote, "the turning point in my life," end of quote, he has observed. In 1971, he accompanied Dr. Kissinger and 3 other American officials on a highly secret 48-hour mission worthy of James Bond to China that paved the way for President Nixon's historic summit meeting with Mao Zedong in February 1972. About this 48-hour clandestine journey to Peking on a plane belonging to the President of Pakistan that departed Islamabad at 3 a.m. and which involved 17 hours of negotiations with Zhou Enlai. To put the media off the scent, the story was circulated that Dr. Kissinger was at a Pakistani hill station recovering from a stomach bug. Of this event, Ambassador Lord told an interviewer, and I quote, "For me personally, there was the realization that I was the first American official to visit China in 22 years, and that I was married to a woman from Shanghai. I will never top this experience in terms of drama," end of quote. With President Nixon in 1972, and again with President Ford in 1975, and of course, starting in 1985 as ambassador, and many times since then, Ambassador Lord has returned to China, becoming over 4 decades the top policy advisor on China-U.S. relations at the Department of State, and one of America's great experts on post-war Chinese history, which he obviously knows firsthand. Ambassador Lord was also involved in the secret peace talks in Paris, which ended the Vietnam War. He has been the chairman of the International Rescue Committee, the chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy, and the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he has been honored with the Defense Department's Outstanding Performance Award and the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. Writing in the New York Times on February 21st of this year, the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's visit, the paper's chief foreign correspondent, John Burns, a former Montgomery Fellow, I add, whom Ambassador Lord once had to get released from a Chinese jail, John Burns wrote, and I quote, I've often said that it's a life of adventure and reward in terms of extraordinary people and places and events that are part of the fabric of a foreign correspondent's life. But little that I have seen has been quite as momentous or quite as exhilarating as that far, fierce hour watching the arrival of Richard Nixon in Peking, end of quote. Of that momentous and fierce hour, Ambassador Lord has himself remarked that it was, quote, the beginning of one of the most remarkable multi-year dialogues ever conducted in diplomacy, end of quote. Without his careful guidance, without his precise, articulate, and sensitive negotiating skills, this beginning could not have come to pass, and this far, fierce hour would not have expanded to become the 40 years of dialogue and mutual respect, despite certain ups and downs that have characterized U.S.-Chinese relations. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to welcome the Honorable Winston Lord as a Montgomery Fellow to speak this afternoon on sweet and sour Sino-American relations. Ambassador Lord.
Thank you, Richard. What a beautiful and thoughtful introduction. At this very hour, one early May, just shy of a half century ago, I married a girl from Shanghai and we launched our joint adventure. By the way, that's the turning point in my life. Ever since, Betty Bow and I have practiced the precept of Adam Smith, division of labor. She manages our finances and real estate. I changed the diapers and scooped up after our frisky lab. You clever community here, you clever students of Dartmouth have surely discerned the underlying theme of my responsibilities. I, clever Yale man, foresaw that someday my foul duties would be done and Betty's never ending. Happily this week, our joint venture at Dartmouth bestows more uplifting roles. Reasoning together, searching for common ground, listening. Courtesy of the Montgomery Fellowship, Betty and I are refreshed as well as honored to immerse ourselves in your community. We can tune out the manic media, the craven legislators, the pandering and polarizing. With you, students and faculties and community members, we explore issues, often with debate, but free of libeling and labeling. We are grateful to the steering committee that invited us to this oasis, in particular to Richard Stamelman, who shapes this program with vision, attention to detail, and passion. And we are delighted to be reunited with our golden friends in our golden years, Peggy and Jim Strickler. Civil discourse and the rejection of extremes are mandatory to dispel the clouds over America's future at home and abroad. And nowhere are balance and nuance more essential than in dealing with China. There are no sure wagers or simple formulas. For the lifetimes of students here, our bilateral relations will be the most consequential and the most complex in the world. There is a torrent of information on China, but as a screenwriter once said about Hollywood, no one knows anything. I think a China expert is an oxymoron, if not a plain moron. He is indeed a vox clamentis in deserto, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness. So why listen to me? Well, as Richard in his typically thoughtful introduction said, I have engaged the Chinese for over 4 decades. And unbeknownst to you, as he alluded to but didn't prove, in 1971, after 22 years of mutual isolation, I, and not Henry Kissinger, was the first American official to visit China. Now, I want to explain this. We were flying, as he said, from Islamabad to Beijing after 22 years being cut off from China. We had Pakistani pilots and flight attendants. As the plane got close to the Chinese border, I went to the front of the plane. Kissinger was in the back. So as we went into Chinese territory, I was there ahead of him. Now, you're about to get carried away with my credentials, so I better inject a note of realism here about how much we really know about China. Just consider the experience that Betty and I had in 1986. We were outside Beijing, and we came upon this beautiful Buddhist temple, and the head monk came out. And frankly, I have to say this, his eyes lit up when he saw a famous international best-selling author and the American envoy to his land. And he said, would you do a great favor for the future visitors to this temple? Would you be willing to write something in English to guide and instruct all who will come to this hallowed place? And of course, we were delighted, we were excited. This is an honor reserved for court poets, great calligraphers, great geopolitical thinkers. So he went away, and we began composing Betty her poetic couplets. I was composing Kissingerian maxims. And he came back with 2 ornate wooden tablets. And he said, now to guide and instruct future visitors, would you write in English on this tablet the word ladies, and on this tablet the word gentlemen? Just when you think you know what's going on. I can, however, guide and instruct you for the next decade with 2 solid projections. First, the economic and political model pursued by the Chinese since 1978 cannot endure. The new leaders soon ascending the stage face not just tactical adjustments, but strategic choices. Second, Sino-American relations will be mixed and fluid. We will certainly not be allies or even strong partners. We will almost certainly not be foes. Let us shed euphoria and despair at each passing phase of U.S.-China relations. In fact, we should recall Mark Twain. When he was assessing the grandiose operas of Richard Wagner, he opined that the music is not as bad as it sounds. What you didn't know is he also judged the music of Britney Spears. And when he saw and heard that, he said, it's not as good as it looks. In short, the fixed menu for our relations is sweet and sour. And a major source of this complexity is native attitudes rooted in history. For Americans, just since the 1940s, Chinese have been allies against Japan, enemies in Korea, yellow hordes, blue ants, and red guards, partners against the polar bear, born-again capitalists, the butchers of Tiananmen Square, and the ominous new superpower. And today there are 2 extreme camps, the apocalyptic and the apologetic. One sees China as a dragon to slay. Because of its growing economic and military prowess, its unsavory political system, and its fierce nationalism, this apocalyptic camp sees a nascent global struggle with the neo-Soviet Union. China is a looming enemy to be contained. Others see China as a panda to hug. This apologetic camp inflates Chinese virtues and downplays, even rationalizes, their transgressions at home and abroad. China is a looming comrade to be coddled. The dragon slayers exaggerate China's strength, ignore its vulnerabilities, and fail to understand that Beijing, for the foreseeable future, is too burdened by its huge domestic travails to mount foreign adventures. The policies of avid budgeteers and ideologues would make Chinese enmity a self-fulfilling prophecy. Containment is not an option. It would brew discord, if not conflict, strain our alliances and bonds with countries seeking good relations with this global giant. We would forfeit Chinese help on a host of issues, and many of these require our joint efforts. America would further rack its reach and its resources. The panda huggers overlook the darker features of the Chinese landscape. Contract-hungry entrepreneurs, visa-anxious academics, fawning former government officials, tiptoe around, if not condone, Beijing's suppression. They shrug at its mercantilism, military surge, and screening of rogue regimes. Such indulgence betrays American values, harms our interests, and loses congressional and public backing. Now, these extreme camps are not Democratic or Republican. They lodge within the parties. Fortunately, the center of gravity rests with those who anchor a balanced approach. 8 successive presidents, from Nixon to Obama, have pursued essentially the same course, a blend of cooperation, competition, and contention. China, in turn, has been the Middle Kingdom for thousands of years, and for 18 of the past 20 centuries, the most powerful nation on the planet. It suffered 1 century of foreign humiliation and invasion. Only in recent decades has it met the world as equals. China is not rising, it is returning. And it returns with a volatile mix of arrogance and insecurity, envy and xenophobia. There are multiple voices and 2 basic clusters in China's foreign policy debate. One continues to endorse Deng Xiaoping's dictum to focus on domestic challenges, refrain from overseas bravado, and project a calibrated, peaceful rise. The other, touted by many in the military and nationalistic bloggers, asserts that it's time to stand up and supplant the world's declining hostile superpower. On our long march together, how to review this great nation? Policy hinges on 4 fundamental questions. Is China's military power a threat? Is China's economic power a juggernaut? Is China's global reach a menace? And is China's domestic system a model? Now, let me not torture you with suspense, but reveal my brave, unequivocal answers to all of the above. Yes and no. Military power. China sees real security concerns. It is flanked by 14 neighbors, the most in the world, with an unsettling medley of historic enmity, instability, large militaries, and nuclear weapons. In Tibet and Xinjiang, 40% of the Middle Kingdom, reside sullen souls. After 20 years of double-digit increases, China's defense budget will continue to leap. It now equals the total budget of the next 12 Asian countries. Its priorities aim at crippling American information systems and denying our access to Chinese spheres of influence. In contrast, the U.S. military is decades ahead in almost every category. Our defense budget is 5 times larger and worth almost the rest of the world's put together. Our neighbors are Mexico, Canada, and 2 vast oceans. We have a sprawling network of allies. And in recent decades, we have, sadly, had extensive combat experience, while the People's Liberation Army last fought in 1979 and was bloodied by the Vietnamese. Economic power. China merits ovations for the greatest, fastest growth in history, pulling hundreds of millions out of poverty. It is the global leader in exports and foreign reserves, as well as the 2nd largest economy. Within a decade or 2, it will surpass the United States. Every day, we pay China $9 billion in trade, every day. Walmart alone imports more from China than all but 5 nations. Chinese hands grasp most of our awesome debt. How? In part because Beijing subsidizes its industries, manipulates its currency, and steals our intellectual property through rip-offs and cyber attacks. In contrast, winning the race for GDP lead is not so taxing when the baton is passed among 1.3 billion runners. China's per capita income equals ours in 1932. It ranks 99th in the world, nestled between Angola and Bosnia. The Chinese landscape is corrupted, polluted, draining resources, thirsty for water, shorn of justice. A demographic specter of historic proportions darkens its horizon. China will grow old before it grows rich. Moreover, leverage and advantage flow both ways. Our economies will mutually flourish or mutually destruct. China's reserves plunge if the dollar plunges. Its goods temper our inflation. And both nations are fueled by trade and investment. Global reach. Clearly, Chinese influence is spreading, aided by sorry spectacles in Washington and Brussels, New Delhi and Tokyo. China is the prime economic partner for Asia and scaling higher elsewhere. It siphons resources in Africa and Latin America through no-strings-attached deals. With the lure of its gigantic market, it inhibits capitals and companies from protesting unfair practices. Its Navy badgers rival claimants in disputed waters. Its diplomatic heat singes book fairs, sporting events, and museums overseas. It forbids governments from elevating Taiwan, hosting the Dalai Lama, or heralding human rights. Wielding its UN Security Council veto and commercial links, Beijing shelters appalling regimes and sabotages sanctions. It props up the murderous North Korean dynasty and dilutes the campaign against Iran's nuclear program. On climate change, it calls on advanced countries to do the heavy lifting. In contrast, a fair accounting of China's global behavior must also record its positive contributions. Unlike the former Soviet Union, Beijing does not station troops overseas or export its ideology. Its trade and investments enrich as well as exploit. Beijing joins to a degree in negotiations, condemnation, and pressures against North Korea and Iran. While pursuing a more robust clean energy policy than ours, it recently agreed to assume its own international commitments. It cooperates on terrorism, narcotics, and crimes. It supports efforts in Afghanistan and is a major source of UN peacekeeping forces. Meanwhile, its skillful diplomacy since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre is fraying. Unease grows about just how peaceful its rise will be. Some developing countries are beginning to view Chinese investments as neo-colonialists, bleeding resources and jobs, abetting corruption and pollution. Commercial exploitation and patronage of dictators cost Beijing in Burma, in Sudan and Zambia, and the Arab Spring. And Chinese provocation in Asian seas drive its neighbors closer to the United States. The Chinese model. To date, their mix of capitalism, socialism, and repression defies history. Unlike Chile, South Korea, Taiwan, China's prosperity has not led to political liberalization. Bankrolls co-opt the middle class and bewitch the young. The leaders invoke nationalism, foreign devils, and the fear of breakup to thwart reforms. The regime squashes any challenge to the party or stirring for freedom with censorship, bullying, detentions, and prison. Spending on internal security now exceeds their defense budget. The amalgam of economic growth and social control appeals to authoritarians around the globe, as well as frustrated voters and panda huggers in democracies. Sympathizers echo Chinese themes. The people cherish order and downgrade freedom. China's size, culture, and legacy of horrific chaos cannot afford the luxury of democratic rule. Moreover, the Chinese motto works better. As the West stumbles, China launches bullet trains faster than the Big Apple plugs potholes. Watch Beijing win the future. Watch the democracies choke in gridlock. In contrast, the Chinese system looks increasingly unsustainable. Don't take my word for it. That is the emphatic conclusion of the present Chinese premier and the World Bank. China cannot live by exports and investments alone. It must boost domestic consumption. It must liberalize its financial controls, reform the banks, raise interest rates. It must weave safety nets so wary Chinese can save less and buy more. It must stop pampering state enterprises and stimulate the nimbler private sector. Serious unrest looms if coming leaders do not tackle such reforms. The sacking of a potential ruler from Chongqing is much more than a murder mystery or a delicious spoof of party unity or testament to the spoils of princelings and the perils of charisma. It dismembers the facade of an orderly, tranquil transition. Beaujolais' fall may signal a victory of reformers or merely the opportune defeat of a rival. Outsiders study the stage, but will never see what actually happened behind the scenes. Beau's rise exposes what citizens witness and manifest day by day, cradle to grave in their own lives. Without favors, bribes, connections, and loss of dignity, little is accomplished, from emergency surgery to parking a car. Like Americans, Chinese only resent the rich if the odds are fixed. Thanks to social media, the rigging is no longer swallowed in silence, but bundled and broadcast to cell phones throughout the provinces. Such issues fuel demonstrations, 500 every day, even by official count. They erupt not just among Tibetans or Uyghurs, but a broader populace chafing at corruption, nepotism, pollution, and land grabs. What recourse but to take to the streets? Courts answer to the party. Lawyers must swear loyalty oaths to the party. The media are bridled by censors or themselves. Officials handpicked and unelected mock accountability. The miraculous escape of a blind and wounded man from paid thugs in Shandong sprang from the vindictiveness of a lawless system, was guided by his inspired vision, and aided by his brave fans. A worthy ending hovers for Chen Guangchen and his immediate family, though sinister fates await others. What is authentic? Chen is a mythic hero for every region and season. China's security forces are outrageous. And on the most sensitive areas, amidst elections and transitions, anger and agony plagued by faulty interpretations and ticking clocks, and all the while exposed in a fishbowl, both countries wrestled, manipulated, and maneuvered to keep our bilateral relations on track. Too big to fail. What is shameless? Monday morning quarterbacks who can't even shut their traps until the game is over and the home team is off the field. An innovative economy, flourishing culture, stable society need pluralism, transparency, rule of law, freedoms of expression and assembly. As my Harvard friend Joe Nye observed, the Chinese assemble iPhones, they don't invent them. Movies focus on the past because the present is whitewashed. Leaders send their pride and joy and their treasure to America. When no safety valves for dissent exist, the downtrodden gather in squares or climb walls. Until artists and Nobel Prize winners are nurtured and not locked away, Chinese talents will smolder, mimic, not imagine the impossible. The billions spent on Olympics and opera houses at home, TV stations and cultural extravaganzas abroad will not accrue soft power. I am not predicting imminent Tiananmen Squares. But in 1989 China, bullhorns were state of the art, while today even colossal censorship cannot track and curb the weapons of mass dissemination. 600 million internet users with 90 million bloggers. Proxy servers, crafty techies, and clever wordsmiths breach even the greatest firewalls. And so the core question is whether China will alter its 30-year-old model of growth and governance. Now, despite all the yeses and nos I've given you, my sixth sense tells me the following. First, Chinese swagger abroad masks paranoia at home. Second, China has been more a free D-rider than contributor to the international system. And third, despite China's flush hand and the current American paralysis, I'd rather hold our cards. How to play our hand in this high-stakes game against an unreadable challenger bending rules to amass chips, but beginning to perspire? Above all, rebuild America. Policy towards China, indeed the world, begins at home. Domestic vigor ordains our leverage and our radiance in the world. Rule out both futile containment and slippery accommodation. Don't demonize or sanitize China. Don't cast it bellicose or benign. Steer a steadfast course through both sunshine and storms. Summon Chinese self-interests. Without them, carrots, sticks, and even spinach will count for little. Maintain military muscle befitting contingencies. Keep our alliances strong. Bolster ties with other rising nations as ends in themselves, but also for insurance, because we live in an era not of a classic transition from one great power to another, but of a broad diffusion of strength. Shape China policy in an Asian framework. Constant focus, military deployments, trade initiatives, regional leadership should not be portrayed as a scheme to encircle China, but as an invitation to build with them a Pacific community. Finally, do not squander our financial and psychological resources on foolhardy expeditions and quixotic nation building. Now, these principles are vital when distrust haunts our vast agenda. Washington professes to welcome China's rise. Beijing professes to welcome America's role in Asia. Neither governments nor publics are converted. True, Americans have ample grounds for wariness, but take a seat on the Politburo. You sniff containment as you cite Americans patrolling close to your borders, executing an Asian pivot, brandishing deployment bases and joint exercises in your neighborhood, renaming part of the South China Sea, and pushing an Asian free trade area minus your presence. Our leaders should meet regularly in private, discard their entourage and scripts, and explore future directions. Such exchanges would form the context for the dialogues like last week in Beijing on economic, political, and military topics. These are designed to avoid miscalculation, manage differences, and cultivate cooperation. Mutual trust cannot be won through declarations. It can only be sown issue by issue over time. Economic concerns are paramount. Through the projected trajectories on both sides, tensions and imbalances should ease. China spurs consumer spending. Labor costs rise. The currency appreciates. Beijing lessens its financial controls. And as it innovates, it begins to respect intellectual property. Such steps should shrink our trade deficit and benefit American companies in China. The United States, in turn, aspires to spend less and invest more. Meanwhile, we must oppose Chinese subsidies and technology theft, focus on access to the Chinese market in competitive sectors like services, negotiate a bilateral investment treaty and encourage Chinese investment in America, and accept on clear-cut military items loosen controls on technology exports. And, above all, frustrate massive cyber attacks led by China, not only China, but led by China, which the leader of our cyber command terms, quote, the greatest transfer of wealth in history. While neither side seeks military conflict, we could lurch into one by accident or miscalculation. We need rules of the road. Our ships and planes track and harass each other in Pacific waters. Treaty ties could suck us into disputes in the South or East China Sea. Cyber attacks, difficult to source, disrupting a key industry or military capability could provoke a crisis. Instability and nuclear weapons in North Korea could draw in our two armies. And we need more transparency in nuclear doctrine, missile defense, and space. But in the meantime, we can map confidence between our militaries through easier issues in cooperation, such as combating piracy and responding to natural disasters. Thanks to enlightened policies in Taipei, Beijing, and Washington, the Taiwan situation, as a potential flashpoint, is the most stable since 1949. Consensus now exists to maintain the status quo of no unification, no independence, and no use of force. Today, there are 16 economic agreements and counting, 500 weekly cross-strait flights, and $200 billion of Taiwan investment on the mainland. So long as Beijing exerts Leninist rule, democratic Taiwan will adhere to its de facto independence. It will neither be seduced nor absorbed by economic integration. Successive Republican and Democratic presidents have pursued a remarkably successful balancing act of bolstering Taiwan's security and improving relations with China. Why fix what has not been broken? While promoting freedom cannot dominate our agenda, it must hold a prominent place. Advancing liberty reflects our values, marshals domestic support, encourages Chinese reformers, and serves our concrete national interests. Democracies do not war with each other, foster terrorism, cover up disasters, or spawn refugees. We should appeal to Beijing's self-interest because political reform would serve its 5 most vital goals: economic growth, political stability, attracting Taiwan, improved relations with America, and greater global stature. Private efforts reinforce these official ones, and I'm particularly promising is the growing number of students, like the ones in this audience, I hope, who are flying both ways across the Pacific. Without Sino-American cooperation, many regional and global challenges are difficult, if not insurmountable. And these common endeavors could provide a framework to manage our enduring frictions over Taiwan, human rights, Tibet, and economics. Teaming up with Moscow, Beijing too often foils international efforts. With North Korea, does it want to risk military clashes and enhance allied missile defenses? On Iran, does it want to spike oil prices and alienate Sunni regimes? In Syria, does it want once again to deny the Arab Spring? Prospects are brighter for the world's 2 largest oil importers and consumers to collaborate on energy and the environment. Both of us seek greener pastures, stable prices, new energy sources, secure sea lanes, and commercial opportunities. And both of us are indispensable to tame climate change. Our interests naturally converge on some global issues: drugs, crime, health, food safety, to name a few. On others, China's posture will not ease until it reckons the cost. Most glaring is its protection of depraved regimes driven by its economic stakes and fears that international pressures on others will set precedents for China. Thus, the central policy theme is encouraging China to be a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Too often it lags or subverts. China should engage not as a concession to others, but as a favor to its future. To be sure, all rising nations have earned the opening to reshape the global structure they inherited. Witness the shift from 7 nations steering the world economy to the group of 20. The UN Security Council needs updating. But Beijing has no license to ignore or upend accepted international law. Human rights covenants, WTO rules, the law of the sea, resolutions of the United Nations. America, in turn, has the urgent duty to get its own house in order. While our relative power in the world will decline, our absolute power need not. We face 3 overlapping imperatives: fortify the fragile economic recovery, slash our mountainous debt, invest in America's future. Until the election in November, we are stuck. Let us hope that soon after, our leaders will cross aisles, not swords, that the media will instruct, not inflame. Americans will once more embark on a bold and common enterprise. Given our current political impasse, economic angst, and mood of melancholy, optimists are rare. Still, American police chiefs and human rights activists do not seek Chinese asylum. And I concur with Alex de Tocqueville, who applauded America's ability to address tangled tribulations. He said, and I quote, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." For we have seen this drama before. Sputnik and the missile gap, the Vietnam War, assassinations, riots, and Watergate, hostages, energy crisis, and malaise, Japan #1 and the invasion of Rockefeller Center, crumbling towers. I recall the late 60s as if it were yesterday. This country was in the most dire straits, whiplashed by domestic turmoil and mired in a foreign quagmire. America has always rebounded. Out of trials we derive strength. Now our uniquely immigrant society should flourish in a shrunken world, its fabric much sturdier, thanks to movement on the bus, shattered ceilings, and the new look of campuses like Dartmouth. What about China? How will it look? Well, we might as well consult fortune cookies. I prefer to rely on Lord Tennyson to reprise my overture. Far away beyond her myriad coming changes, China will be something other than the wildest modern guess of you and me. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Lord would be happy to answer questions. We have microphones which will circulate, and please, before you ask your question, wait for the microphone. Let me take this opportunity to also say that tomorrow, same place, same time, 4:30 here, Betty Ballard will engage in a conversation with Professor Melissa Zeiger of the English Department about many different topics, her writing, nonfiction and fiction books she has written, and also her work as a humanitarian. So I invite you to return tomorrow, 4:30, 5 noon, to hear the second installment of the Lord couple. All right, who would like to ask the first question? Please give us testing.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Yu Xiang. I came from Sichuan, China originally. I'm a graduate student here. I'm a senior at Dartmouth College. And thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'm curious to hear your opinion regarding the recent island disputes between China and its Southeast Asian neighbors, more specifically with Philippines. And how do you think those island disputes is going to challenge the relationship between China and the U.S.? And on the more recent news, this morning the Japanese satellite has detected Chinese mobilizing its troops to the South China Sea. And do you think China and Philippines are likely to engage in a conflict? And if so, do you think America will be able to honor its 1951 treaty with the Philippines and provide military assistance?
These are very good questions. Seriously, particularly if it's a complex question, if I leave out something or it looks like I'm being evasive, come back at me with a follow-up. That goes for all of you. Very good questions. And let me say that South China Sea is what he's referring to. And there are disputed claims among many countries there. And I'd say after North Korea and the terrorism emanating from Pakistan, the South China Sea is probably the most dangerous place right now. Quick answer to part of your question, no, they won't go to war. We will fulfill our treaty commitments if it comes to that, but it's not going to come to that. There could be some tense moments, but I don't believe. I don't know the full implications of this latest report about Chinese deployments. Let me quickly point out the South China Sea, of course, is an extremely important geographical position for sea lanes. 70,000 container ships pass through there every year, something like $5 trillion of trade. In addition, 1/10 of all the world's fish or fishery takes place in that area, 1/10. Then, of course, you've got tremendous potential oil and gas reserves underneath. So it's probably worth fighting about almost. No, of course it isn't. But it does show you the stakes, shows you the stakes involved. China has the most extensive claims. They have a dotted map of 9 dashes. I won't go into great detail here. It is somewhat ambiguous, but it is the most ambitious. And they don't claim all of the South China Sea, but if you look at how they extend their claims beyond islands, they claim it's almost the whole China Sea. Then you got the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, Brunei, and Indonesia all having interest in this area, some greater than others. The U.S. has an interest in freedom of navigation, but we've been very careful, and I made a similar statement 20 years ago when I was Assistant Secretary, that we don't take a position on the sovereignty claims. But we do insist on freedom of navigation. We have some disputes with China about the kind of activities we can conduct in a 200-mile economic zone. So this is a bilateral U.S.-China issue as well. One thing the United States should do is ratify law of the sea, which applies to some of these issues. It's in our interest, the Pentagon, the State Department, everyone's for it. It's an outrage we haven't. This thing was produced many years ago. I helped even write a speech pushing for it with Kissinger in the 70s. We'd be in a much stronger position, although we observe it, in terms of freedom of navigation and so on. I think what has to happen, that has to happen. The U.S. should stick to not getting involved in any of the claims, but urging the countries to solve this peacefully. There should be some setup of hotlines or between the various countries so that they don't stumble into miscalculations. And there ought to be some agreement to postpone resolution of the sovereignty claims, but undertaking joint commercial exploration of the resources. That would be, to me, the best way to keep this thing cool. But you're right to raise it. It's become a significant issue in our relations with China, but above all in China's relations with its neighbors. And it's one reason, as I said in my speech, there's been a little blowback on China's diplomacy because they were quite aggressive in pursuing some of these claims. And most recently, it is with the Philippines that it's the most dangerous. Is there any part that I... Well, yeah, there's other disputes with Japan. I'm getting some advice from one of my speechwriters here. There's also disputes with Japan, which, of course, with our mutual treaty obligations could also draw us in. And there was the same year that the Chinese were pressing their claims in the South China Sea, they got into disputes with the Japanese over fishing. So these maritime disputes and the resources underneath them are very dangerous, and you're absolutely right to raise that question as a potential flashpoint. Gentleman here, I guess.
Thanks. Could you comment on the fact that the majority of Chinese leaders are trained as engineers and the majority of American leaders are trained as lawyers, and what that means for the future of our two systems?
I promise to skip all the lawyer jokes. I'm not sure I buy your premise on the American side that most of our leaders are lawyers, but the Clintons and, there's a few in there, Obama. It's a good point, at least recently, in terms of presidents. Chinese leadership has evolved. Since the communists took over. And I've been able to meet with every single one of them. The first ones, of course, were Mao and Zhou Enlai. They had revolutionary credentials, long march, military credentials. The bad news is that they could rule by decree. The good news, they could get things done, sometimes horrible things. But they were of that background. Then you had Deng Xiaoping, similar background with the same credentials, and he was pretty much a one-person show. But since then, as you implied, you had Jiang Zemin and now Hu Jintao who's about to leave, people who are essentially engineers and who didn't have these revolutionary credentials, they were too young, or military background. And so they've come to the top through economic performance in the provinces and bureaucratic infighting skill to get allies. And it's been more and more collective leadership, starting with Jiang Zemin and now. The good news is that you don't have one person running this show. The bad news is they often can't get things done. And one of the key questions when I talk about the decisive steps that have to be taken about their reforms in the next 10 years, are they going to be able to do that with a collective leadership? Interestingly, the next batch of leaders, we don't know. And we've just seen how it's getting rather uneasy over there about the transition, which is supposed to take place in November, but just in recent days, there are rumors they might postpone this for a couple of months, ostensibly to shorten the transition period between when they're chosen and when they serve, but really because they're still dealing with the aftermath of Chongqing and Bojilai. But a lot of these people coming along now actually are lawyers and have different backgrounds. We're not sure who's going to get in there. So they're getting a little bit away from engineers in this next round. The one thing I would urge, I won't dwell on the American side about why it's lawyers. I can't really explain that. The thing about lawyers, they're very good at parsing things and details. They don't necessarily have great conceptual strength. Now alienated every lawyer in the business. But and you need both. You need strategic vision and you need tactile negotiating and other skills. The one thing about Chinese leaders is do not try to predict what they're going to do. That's true of China in general, as I tried to make clear in my remarks. But just take what's happened. No one predicted. People knew that Deng Xiaoping would be much more pragmatic and positive than Mao. But no one could predict the incredible reforms he instituted, the opening to the outside world. And these reforms have lasted 30 years. They've now run their course, but they've lasted a long time, and you've seen tremendous growth. So he was a surprise. Jiang Zemin, I knew when he was mayor of Shanghai, I was ambassador, I was not impressed. His successor, Zhu Rongji, who was then later prime minister, was much more impressive. People generally dismissed Jiang Zemin as a buffoon. He'd sing American songs, quote the Gettysburg Address, and that this guy was not going to be very effective. By Chinese standards, he turned out to be quite effective. The economy grew by leaps and bounds. He improved relations with the United States, and he got Hong Kong back into the fold. And along comes Hu Jintao. I met him when he was head of the Central Party School before he took over. And he was close to a man named Hu Yabang, who was considered by Chinese standards liberal, Communist Youth Party, and the man who set off the Tiananmen Square massacre. But he died, and his funeral and the protests there began that whole episode. So Hu Jintao was close to him. Hu Jintao, when I saw him, was studying political reforms in the Central Party School. So we all said to ourselves, here comes Thomas Jefferson, right? I'm afraid not. They've gone backwards. They not only haven't done any political reforms, in certain areas they've gone backwards in recent years, certainly since the Olympics and even more so since the Arab Spring. We've got one over here. We'll alternate, I guess.
Jennifer has a question. Then
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the China-Iran connection.
Sure.
Obviously, this is one of the most serious policy issues facing the U.S. today in terms of maybe having to fight a war with Israel against Iran if diplomacy and sanctions to pressure the Iranians fail. And sanctions is this important vehicle that would be an alternative to war, and yet China is serving as a major spoiler in that effort. And so I wonder if you could talk about China's interest in that particular dispute.
This is a good example, a good question. Remember I said one of the principles of our relations has to be summon Chinese self-interest. You can pressure them, you could cajole them, and what I meant by spinach, along with sticks and carrots, was try to point out why it's good for them. Eat your spinach. Unless the self-interests are involved, it's not going to work. So in Iran, what you do, as I said, they have been undercutting sanctions, as you suggested, because of their interest in oil. They have been moving, however, somewhat. They will never say officially for reasons of face, and because they want good relations with Iran, they will never say that we're going to cut down on our Iranian imports. But in fact, they are beginning to do so, not in a dramatic fashion, but in terms of the kinds of oil and stuff they're getting, they're finding ways to somewhat respond and not undercut sanctions quite as much. So what you do is you go to them and say, look, we understand you have an oil interest with Iran. But you also have an interest, as I suggested, that You don't have an Iran with nuclear weapons, which increases instability in the Gulf, dries up oil prices, and you're the world's second largest oil importer. Do you really want that to happen? Do you really want to alienate all the other Arab and Muslim regimes in the region, most of whom are Sunnis, who don't like Shiite Iran? So you got to find a way to pursue your self-interest. And by the way, we'll help you. We're telling the Saudi Arabians to step up their exports to you so you can decrease your reliance on the Chinese. That is what's happening. I'm sorry? What did I say? What did I say? Chinese. I said on the Chinese? Okay. Could someone remove this disruptive... Listen, I'll get back at you tomorrow, you know. Very quickly on Iran while we're at it. I'm going to oversimplify this because I want to have plenty of time for other questions. But the issue on Iran is the level of, I'm going to really boil this down, of uranium enrichment. Uranium enrichment is only useful for weapons if it gets to about the level of 20. If it's below that, all they need for what they say they want it for, namely electricity, it's 3.5. So the debate in American policy circles is, do you strike a deal in which you give them the right to enrich uranium, which they have the right to do, they're a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for civilian purposes, and get really heavy inspections by the IEA to make sure they're not going up to the 20 level for weapons elsewhere, and they have a little bit of that going on now. Isn't that a good deal? Versus those who say, no, you can't trust the Iranians, you can't trust international inspections, and no matter how elaborate they are, they're going to secretly produce these weapons and break out someday. So that's a debate. I'm in favor of the former option. I think that'd be a good deal. There's no way Obama can do that deal between now and the elections because Romney would kill him on it, and others would disagree. The Israelis have mixed views on this kind of deal. I think the sanctions are beginning to hit them. I was recently at lunch with somebody who's been very close to this, and no one's naive. The Iranians have fooled us before, but there was a different attitude in their meeting with the negotiating partners, which are the Security Council nations, essentially. And the feeling is, I think we could make a deal if we went to that first option of allowing them uranium enrichment. Right, so far the official position has been no enrichment, and that's never going to fly, in my opinion.
Would you, Mr. Ambassador, clarify Governor Romney's statements on China a little bit, and what happens if Governor Romney is elected president for American foreign policy? Okay,
I will try to be nonpartisan if I can. I have worked, seriously, I'm a flaming centrist, and I don't like extremes. I do think the polarization is due to both sides, but it's much more on the Republican side. The Republican Party is leaving the center, and I think it's too bad. But having said that, yes, Romney's made some extreme statements. One is that he's going to cause China to be considered a manipulator of currency on day one. Now, in fact, they have been manipulating currency, as I said, but they've been appreciating in their own self-interest, and that's much less of an issue than intellectual property rights and investment in China and subsidizing. So what do you do on that issue? Look, presidents have a way of saying one thing on the campaign trail and turning around on the other. Much more generally, because he's had to win the primaries, at least he felt he had to go to the far to the right on a lot of issues, including on foreign policy, which he's called Russia is our big geopolitical enemy. He's essentially trying to out-hawk Netanyahu on Iran. So there's been a lot of statements. Now, having said that, I do think, compared to the alternatives, he'll probably find a way to tone this down once he gets in office. And it won't be the first time the presidents have done it. Quick answer to your question is, one reason the Chinese solved this Chen Guangcai case, it's not the main reason by any means, but it must have occurred to them, do they really want to embarrass not only Mrs. Clinton and the embassy, but the president, and give Romney and his campaign firepower on this issue? Do they really want to have Romney as president instead of Obama? Now, again, I don't want to overemphasize this. That's not the main reason, but they understand our politics, and they're not rooting for Romney. Now, having said that, generally, they like conservatives more than liberals, actually. They can protect their flank in dealing with them. Romney would fit a pattern, I think, the final answer to your question, like previous candidates. We've had a pattern in American politics where each challenger to the presidency says that the incumbent in the White House is too soft on China. So I remember after Nixon and Ford left office, Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski, and I was briefing Brzezinski during the transition, but they all thought that Nixon and Kissinger had been seduced by the Chinese and too soft. They were going to get tougher. Tried for a year to improve relations with Moscow, not with China. Didn't work. Brzezinski went over there, and to his credit, carved out a new trajectory. The remainder of the Carter presidency, they made major moves with China, and they normalized diplomatic relations with China. Along comes Ronald Reagan. Reagan's pro-Taiwan, wants to reestablish official relations, says that Carter sold out Taiwan and was soft on communism. After settling Taiwan in the first couple of years, by the time I got to China, I was very fortunate. It was probably the best time we've ever had with China, not thanks to Betty and me. That was, of course, not the main reason, because we got over the Taiwan tensions and we left before Tiananmen Square. So we're in that window where we were not only increasing trade and cabinet visits and the first ship visit to China, we sold China $800 million of arms. We cooperated along the Soviet border, spying on their satellites. We both provided and combined to provide weapons to the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. My point is, Reagan switched. Then, at the beginning of George Bush's senior's administration, you had Tiananmen Square, and of course we had bad relations. By the time he left, things looked better. Bill Clinton campaigned and said that Bush was much too soft after Tiananmen Square, talked about the butchers of Beijing, and then we moved ahead. I'm not going into detail. By the time I left as Assistant Secretary, we had much better relations with China. So I think Obama is not fit the pattern. It wasn't so much in his campaign, and we got off to a relatively good start the first year. That's a long answer. I want to give you the context of why I don't think a Romney presidency would set back our relations. So many questions. I hope I get to everybody here. I don't know what order to choose people, but I'm going to go to some students next.
I just wonder if you can give a prognostication. Will it be one man in China who opens the door further to more freedom for the Chinese people, or is that impossible in the culture?
Well, the really honest answer is we can't be sure. It may take some far-sighted vision and some courage on behalf of a person. But I don't think, just like Deng Xiaoping almost single-handedly opened up on reforms and economics, I don't think it's going to be one man. First place, it's going to come from below. It's already coming through the internet and so on, and people's concerns. It is going to take some decisive leadership, but I think it's still going to be several people and not one at the top interacting with other layers down below. Yes, we'll get some students here.
Hi, Mr. Ambassador. I'm also a student here at Dartmouth. I'm from China, international student. And I really loved your speech. It seemed to me that you paint a holistic picture of the Sino-American relationship in the past 30 years. And you mentioned a lot of details, and it was really neutral. So going back to the Chen Guangcheng case, which happened recently, I've been reading some Chinese news, and obviously they use the same kind of rhetoric against the American government by depicting Mr. Chen and as a political tool used by the American government to intervene the Chinese sovereignty. We've heard a lot of stuff like that. But I've also seen a lot of comments from the internet users, things like the American embassy in China is the sole permanent safe haven for freedom. And Also, we seek a beacon for life from a blind lawyer. So personally, I was really ashamed by this event, this incident that's coming from my own government. But then just going back to this issue, we've seen tighter social control in the recent year, as you mentioned before, that it's kind of like a backward movement. I also quote Secretary Hillary Clinton that it's errands full. The Chinese government is, the Chinese government is running a fool's errand in terms of historical development. So you also served as ambassador in China back in the 80s, which is a very different era. I was born in the 90s, so I didn't get opportunity to actually witness the kind of freedom and the more tolerant political environment back then. But as I learned more about that, yeah.
Interesting, but if you could...
I could speed up. So I was really appalled. And I also watched a congressional hearing a couple of days ago, and a few U.S. congressmen called for American government to take more substantive actions against all this violation of human rights. But we've kind of seen that.
Would you like me to comment on this episode in general?
Yeah. Just how.
I think we want to get to other questions.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just wondering, how would you look upon the prospect for democratic reforms in China, and what kind of role American government should play, as a lot of people have different expectations for the American government to play a role in Chinese internal politics? Well.
Okay. Well. I mentioned briefly how I thought we should go about this, and I'll get back to the Chen case because I assume there's general interest in that, so I will take a little time on that issue. But on the general issue of promoting reform, it's going to have to come from within China. We can't impose it. We can encourage it, and we ought to speak out about it privately in dialogues and also publicly, but not in an arrogant way, but as I said in my speech, appealing to Chinese self-interest. So we can play a facilitating role, not only in China but elsewhere. We have concrete national interests, as I said. But we cannot, we're not going to help reformers if we stay silent, but we're not going to help them if it looks like we're the intruder and the Chinese authorities can point to us as interfering in their affairs. So you've got to be careful in how you promote this. You can promote exchanges and civil society and lawyers going back and journalists and so on, and speak out. But it's basically going to have to come from the Chinese people. Now, on the Chen case, I'm assuming there's interest in that. First of all, the fact that they're attacking Chen and us, it's not good news, but it's not bad news. The Chinese are going to let him go. Number one, because if they don't, there's a real crisis in our relationship, and we've seen that both sides, as I said in my speech, wanted to make sure that this relationship stayed on track. Secondly, Chen will cause less trouble for Chinese authorities in China than he will outside. And the reason this great patriot wanted to stay in China was he knew that when dissidents come over here, they're a celebrity for a few weeks and then they disappear and they don't have impact. And to his credit, despite all the risks, he continually said he wanted to stay in China. The fact that he said that, the fact that he has said he'd like to come back to China, that he's only going overseas not for asylum, but for study. The fact that he's not breaking any Chinese laws, he served a sentence. This guy was in prison for over 4 years for causing a traffic jam. I'm serious. And it was a little tough because he was in house arrest when he supposedly caused this traffic jam. No, really, this is true. I'm not making this up. You can't make this stuff up. But he served that sentence, and therefore the Chinese can say he's not illegal, even though they illegally held him there. But the central authorities to whom he appealed, he said, oh, you, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm sure you're not aware of what these thugs are doing down in Shandong, so you please clear this up. So in every way, he saved Chinese face. It's one reason he's going to get out. Let me just add quickly, I really felt, as I said, it was shameless, whether it was Romney or the congressman jumping in the middle of this thing when they didn't know what was going on, and when it was not fully carried out. Look, there were some tactical mistakes. I could name them. I'm not going to do that right now. But the fact is, we're going to get this guy out. It's probably a better solution than if he stayed. It's tough for him, but that would have been awfully tricky for the Chinese to fulfill an agreement which says we're going to determine how they treat their citizens, and we're going to monitor it and check in all the time on how they're doing. That's pretty tough for the Chinese authorities, and that would have been tough to play out. And then we would have this constant tension in our relationship, constant catcalls from the balconies back here in the United States. So the fact is, whatever the tactical mistakes, and going on in a video and saying it was Mission Impossible was not the greatest, but on the whole, the ambassador and his team and Hillary Clinton took a lot of risks. There was some stumbles along the way, but the bottom line is it's going to be a relatively happy ending, although we don't know what's going to happen to some of the people left behind. A final point, I'm sure you read about this guy, but this guy is amazing. He was blind almost from birth, of course. He had no schooling until he was either 13 or 17, depending on various accounts, so he was illiterate. He self-teaches himself, learns the law, and then he never challenges the party or the government. He only says you've got to have the authorities implement the Chinese laws and constitutions. He wasn't saying overthrow anything. He says, here's what's already written, just do what you're supposed to. And stop these local authorities in Shandong from making 8-month-old babies be killed for the population policy. Literally 8 months old, they would still kill them under the population. So he was on their behalf. And then he's blind. He climbs 8 walls. He escapes all the authorities. He's got a broken foot in his first jump, and he makes it to Beijing. Now, having said that, my strong suspicions, and I think the strong suspicions in China, is that he needed to get some inside help to do this. I don't see how he could possibly have pulled this off. But it's quite a story, and it'll be a Hollywood movie someday, I'm sure.
Hi, I just want to have a comment. Since like historically, like Chinese and Western worlds have kind of like conflict past, such as the foreign troop invasion in the 1860s, and then following by the World War II and the Cold War. So I think like the China and U.S. Relationship started as kind of an unbalanced or a kind of unfriendly start. So that's kind of like lead us to what we are now currently, because I think Chinese and U.S. people see each other, like see different countries. They look at their negative side first. Like when we consider, like when in China, like the news or the television news, they report the bad side of U.S. And while in the U.S., people focus on the short of the unrespect to the human rights and the kind of manipulation of currency on China first. So I think it's kind of like unfair for Chinese people because like U.S. people always consider it as a potential enemy, but like U.S. will never do this to, for example, for UK or France because they're allies at the beginning. So I think if it's possible, like for people in different
Again, we want to have everyone have a chance.
So I think if it's possible for us to change our mind, to see the difference, other than the disagreement.
Well, there's several issues here. First of all, you're right, and I said in my speech that historical experiences complicate our relationship. In the case of China, I said that foreign invasion and humiliation for a century means they envy some of the outside world, but they also are xenophobic. Having said that, the U.S. on the whole was much better behaved in Chinese eyes than the British, the Japanese, the Germans, etc. And so we found when we were in China, I think it's generally true that on a personal basis, the Chinese preferred Americans to certainly the Japanese and many other nationalities. So the historical baggage is there. It's sometimes beaten to death by Chinese as an excuse, but nevertheless it's real, but it's not so much American involvement as it is the Opium Wars and the Japanese invasion and so on. Now, it is true that our media plays up some of the problems with China as opposed to the positive signs. As I said, what you want to do is cooperate on areas like climate change and narcotics, the economy, even North Korea and Iran, to the point where the American people can see that in addition to these problems like Taiwan, Tibet, and human rights, we have these larger issues we're engaged in, so it's a mixed relationship, not just negative. Having said that, I'll take the U.S. press fairness over the Chinese press any day. And also the Chinese, they've just kicked out an Al Jazeera representative who happens to be an American. I'm not going to stand here for the U.S. being unfair in its media compared to the way the Chinese handle it. I think both sides can be more constructive, and I'm not saying our press is always fair, but you ought to read some of the stuff in the Chinese press. It's pretty discouraging. Probably should, here, I guess.
Thank you. My question was really short, but I was wondering if you see the government, the Chinese government, enacting some kind of broad democratic reforms, the way they did economic reforms in the 70s, sometime in the future, and if that does happen, do you think it would go down the same way as perhaps Glasnost and Perestroika did for the Soviet Union?
Well, because of the Soviet Union's experience, the Chinese are even more reluctant to introduce political reforms than otherwise. They felt that Gorbachev had political reforms without enough economic progress, and therefore the Communist Party lost Russia and they lost their empire. So that example is a warning as far as they're concerned. I said they've defied history. So far, there hasn't been political liberalization. They keep talking about it and it's some vague goal in the future. But the most that the leaders are thinking about is political reform within the Communist Party. Better qualified leaders, maybe some 20 people for 15 places, so there's some choice among the selected for the party leaders. But they're not talking about multi-party democracy. Now, having said that, democracy is not just elections. It's a free press, it's the rule of law, it's civil society. Many of these have to go before elections. Many of these are important building stones. So this is where it's going to have to happen and most likely to happen first. To answer your question, I don't know whether it's going to happen. I'm relatively optimistic over a fairly long time period. First of all, even though the middle class has not pushed for political liberalization, they've only reached $5,000 per capita, and studies show, whether it's South Korea, Taiwan, or elsewhere, you get to 6,000 or 7,000 people begin to press for political freedom. Secondly, if they want their economy to flourish in a global economy, it's so dependent on information, at some point they're going to have to loosen their censorship. They try to divide it between non-sensitive and sensitive topics. You need the rule of law to ensure investments. You need a free press to attack corruption, which is the single biggest problem in China. So necessities should help drive them. And there's already some leaders, I think, including the current prime minister, who understand the need to move in some of these directions. Then you throw in the social media, the Arab Spring, the fact they can't control everything in terms of people's aspirations. I think you put all that together, over the 10 or 20-year period, they will move. Now, the question is, like the previous question, will it be one or two brave people? Will it be a consensus in the leadership? Will it come from below? Will it be violent? Will it be fits and starts? I can't tell you that. And if anyone does, don't listen to them and don't believe them.
I'm wondering, if liberalization leads to economic innovation and success, would the U.S. still perceive a democratic China that would theoretically be more economically powerful and militaristically more powerful than it is now? Would they still perceive a democratic China as a threat? How would the U.S. respond to that?
What, if China's getting stronger but then becomes democratic?
Yeah.
We would welcome it. And we say that we welcome it. And it has the added virtue of being sincere, even though it's not believed. Because at least the right-thinking people, I talked in the Dragon Slayers have decided already they're going to be an enemy. And they're a minority. They're not going to dictate our policy, just like the panda huggers are a minority. But we're not going to have a problem-free relationship if they become a democracy. We don't have problem-free relationships with the best democracies in the world. But they'll be managed within a framework of shared values that will ease so many of our tensions. So it's not a strong China that we feel or shouldn't feel. All we have to do is do our own business and rebuild at home. We can compete with China and cooperate with China. But a strong China that has this continued political system could be a problem. And let me end on why I think if we get our act together, and that's a big if right now, why we can welcome China. And by the way, it's not just a rising China. I stress that. You've got the BRICS now. They call it Brazil, Russia, India, China, and they throw S in for South Africa. But those are already slowing down. Here comes Turkey. Here comes Indonesia. Here comes the Philippines. Here comes Poland and Czechoslovakia. They're all going to grow faster. They're not as big. My point is it's a broad diffusion of power. It's not just a rising China. It's a multipolar world. I honestly believe, as I said in my closing, that we've got the assets to compete in that. It's pretty hard to be optimistic right now. But look at the following. First, our military power just dwarfs anybody else. Secondly, our economy is still twice the size of China, and I talked about the per capita difference, and China going rich after they grow poor, if they grow rich at all. The demographics. We're going to have 100 million more people by 2050 and 40% larger labor force. China is already contracting. Right now, it's got 6 workers for every retiree. You throw in one child policy, longer survival rates, they're heading for a demographic nightmare. And by the year 2050, there'll be 2 workers for every retiree. So we got it's not just our advantage with China, with Japan, Europe, and many other countries. We've got the best universities like Dartmouth in the world, and people are coming here, 750,000 foreign students in the United States. We're the only country that can respond effectively to natural disasters, to keeping the sea lanes open, to providing foreign aid. We're even getting less dependent on foreign energy sources. So we've got every reason, if we can get our political act together, to be able to coexist with China. And if we are self-confident and strong and we use these assets, then what I said was sincere really is sincere. We welcome a strong China that we can cooperate on these problems on and we can coexist with. We have no reason to fear them. We have every reason to be self-confident. I want to just end by, again, thanking you, Richard, thanking you for your terrific attention and questions and how much fun Betty and I are having here and how much we're learning here at Dartmouth. And tomorrow afternoon is a better show than this afternoon. Be sure to come.